Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this very important forum on food security and reframing the approach to dealing with it. What I'd like to do over the next 30 to 40 minutes is to suggest that there are 10 action issues that we need to pay attention to now. There may be many others. I have identified 10 that I think are particularly important. And I'm going to present those in the context of the framework provided by the two previous speakers. The first critically important action issue is that we actually take action. There is way too much talk, there are way too many plans, there is way too much rhetoric, and I contribute to it. We do need to turn some of those plans into action, and every time a new initiative comes about, the first thing that is done is another plan and another set of rhetorics and another set of meetings, and often the money is spent before the action actually takes place. We have all been to a number of conferences where this particular translator is missing. That is the one that translates rhetoric into action. So that, to me, is a critically important action issue. I was also asked to talk about who should take the action, and that is clearly up to all of us who have any power of implementing plans. Let me say a couple of words about how I define food security. A person who has access to sufficient food to live a healthy and productive life is food secure. A person who does not is food insecure. It is a matter of access. So we don't worry about production. Yes, of course we do, because without production and without production increases, the access cannot be assured. We cannot have access without production, but we can have production without access. And that's a very important point, that merely increasing the pile of food without worrying about who has access to it is not going to assure food security for all. Here is the record of food security according to FAO, beginning in 1990. We have basically done nothing to improve the food security in terms of number of people who suffer. If you look at this graph, the number was almost constant at somewhere around between 800 and 900 million people. And I want to remind you that that is roughly 1 in 7 people in the world. When the food prices went up, FAO estimated that the number of food insecure people increased, as you will see on this graph, up to about 1 billion. It then came down a bit because of the food price decreases. These numbers may or may not be correct because they are based on rather shaky set of data. What I think we can say is that we are maintaining roughly the number of people who are food insecure. It really has not changed. If you look at the blue line, that shows where we should be. We should be on the blue line in order to reduce by half the number of food insecure people over the 25-year period, 1990 to 2015. That was the World Food Summit goal that was agreed to by 186 countries back in 1996. We are not anywhere close to achieving that goal. Some countries have already achieved the goal, including China and a few others. A few African countries will achieve, they will not achieve this goal, but they will achieve the next goal, which is the Millennium Development Goal. Because in year 2000 at the Millennium Summit, the goal was made a little easier. Instead of reducing the number of hungry people by 50%, we will just reduce the proportion of the population in a particular year by 50%. And because population is growing, it's easier to achieve the Millennium Development Goal. We are, as you can tell, not achieving that either. We're supposed to go from 20 to 10%, and we are currently at somewhere around 17%, which is not that much below where we were in 1990. Some countries are achieving this goal. Some African countries are achieving the goal not because they're reducing the number of hungry people, but because they have a very large population increase. And that was not exactly the intent. But because you're having a fraction, if you have a large population increase and you can keep your number of hungry people constant, you can actually achieve this goal. Not exactly what was meant. Action issue number 2, we need to speed up the eradication of food insecurity and malnutrition. Why? For humanitarian reasons. People are suffering. 2, for reasons of economics. There was a book written by Derek Tribe that some of you may be familiar with, Doing Well by Doing Good. What Derek was saying was that by helping people escaping food insecurity and poverty and malnutrition, they become more productive citizens. They're going to demand more from the rest of the economy at the same time as they produce more for the economy, and that will be reflected, for example, in more import demand from Australian producers. I'm not sure if you can separate out the Australian producers from the American producers, but the point is that as people become better off and more productive, they're going to demand more goods and services, which generates economic growth in the developing countries, which translates into more trade. Just imagine if sub-Saharan Africa had the economic growth of some of the Southeast Asian countries, such as Korea and Taiwan and others. Imagine what kind of market would have existed in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a humanitarian reason, then there's a self-interest reason on the part of those of us who are fortunate enough not to suffer from hunger and malnutrition. The other point I want to raise here is that food security is not identical to nutrition, to good nutrition. It takes more than food security to achieve good nutrition. So let me show you the three kinds of malnutrition, if you like. We have hunger, which is what FAO is estimating. FAO is estimating calorie intake, the energy intake. And that's what the numbers I just showed you refer to. But then we have what we call hidden hunger, which is deficiencies in micronutrients. And there you have many more people suffering, maybe as many as 2 billion, maybe twice as many as suffering from energy deficiency or calorie deficiency. And then we have a rapidly increasing prevalence of overweight and obesity, not just in high-income countries, not just among high-income people in developing countries, but also among low-income people and middle-income people in many developing countries. Action issue number 3, then, is that I think we need to go beyond rhetoric and seriously introduce nutrition and food security goals into food system policies. And some of you are going to say, well, but we've done this all the time. Well, yes, we paid tribute to it. We have talked about it. But there's a lot more that can be done if when we design and implement our food system policies, including agricultural policies, with improved nutrition in mind. We can greatly increase the nutrition impact per dollar spent in the food system policies. In fact, I would go as far as to argue that nutrition goals should be incorporated as goals of what we do in food systems. They may not be the only goal, but they should be one of the goals that we should be taking seriously. And we're not doing that in very many cases. Action issue number 5, and this was already mentioned by the previous speakers, is to manage the food price volatility. We had tremendous volatility in food prices since 2005, and I'm going to show you Just a few graphs to kind of illustrate this point. This shows the maize weekly price minus a 12-month moving average. And if you look all the way to the right, which to you would be over there, you will see the rapidly increasing fluctuations in maize prices. The same is true for rice. You see much more fluctuation in rice prices during the last few years, and the same is true for wheat. You already know this because this has affected Australia as well as the rest of the world. So why is this happening? I'm arguing, but there isn't a total agreement on this among people who have looked at it. I'm arguing that these price fluctuations begin with production fluctuations caused by extreme weather events. And I don't need to tell you what that means, given that you currently have flood in Queensland, you've had droughts over several years, you have had floods, you've been hit by all of these extreme weather events with resulting fluctuations in production. Well, if that is correct, if that is where these price fluctuations begin, then it seems to me we need to pay a lot more attention to adaptation to the climate change. Yes, we can do something in the food system to mitigate the effect. Certainly agriculture can be modified, can be changed to absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere, for example. But I'm arguing that most of the mitigation that would have to take place would have to be based on international agreements. And if you have followed the international trade summits in Copenhagen, in Mexico, and more recently in Durban, where they could barely agree on when to have the next meeting, and they certainly couldn't agree on much else, we are far from international agreements on mitigating the impact of climate change. So it seems to me that those of us who are focused on the food system should pay a lot, and we can do certain things on mitigation without international agreement, but not very much. For example, if Denmark introduced a burp tax on cows in order to reduce methane emission from cows, Germany would take over the beef market in Denmark. The competitiveness, of course, would suffer when one country introduces green taxes or any other similar policy intervention. This presumably would be true for Australia as well. But I have a rule that says if I've been in a country for less than a few months, I'm not going to comment on that country's policies. And I've only been here for about 10 days, so I'm still an expert, not confused with facts. So adaptation, it seems to me, is the game we need to pursue in the food system. What kinds of things am I suggesting? The things we all know about. We need agricultural research. We need to increase investment in agricultural research, and we need to focus it on adaptation to climate change. And that means drought tolerance. It means more tolerance towards flooding in certain crops, etc., etc. And there are people in this audience who know a lot more about the specifics of ag research, and they're going to talk after me. So let me not say more about that. We need to pay a lot more attention to risk management, or management of risk and uncertainty, not only among farmers, but also among traders and consumers. When poor consumers who spend 60 to 80% of their income on food are faced with these dramatic food price fluctuations, it hurts. It really does. We need to help them manage those kinds of uncertainties and those kinds of risks. And there are many different policies that can be implemented, some of which we have already talked about. Production systems can be changed to better adapt to climate change. And again, I'm not going to go into specifics, partly because my time will run out and partly because others are going to talk about it. Water management requires a lot more attention. The efficiency in the use of water in agriculture generally is very low. agriculture and the rest of the food system can use water much more efficiently than what's currently done. And there are policy interventions that can be put in place. Water pricing, for example, in cases where water is a free good, eliminating electricity subsidies in India would be a nice step to take, and a number of other things, water user associations, and so on. So production volatility, as I'm arguing, results in price volatility, and as I mentioned before, the extreme weather events are behind all of this, but there are other things that I call amplifying factors. And this was mentioned again this morning, that when a country is faced with potentially increasing food prices, it tends to forget international agreements. And it just kind of looks after its own population. Maybe that is to be expected, but nevertheless, when India put in place an export ban on rice, it contributed to dramatic increases in rice prices. Vietnam followed very quickly thereafter, and so did Cambodia and other countries. When countries introduce what economists call beggar thy neighbor policies like that, meaning they protect their own population at the expense of the rest of the world, they're passing on these price fluctuations to the rest of the world, they tend to forget that they are members of the World Trade Organization. Or maybe the World Trade Organization really didn't have in place the kind of rules and regulations that were needed. So this is an area that requires a lot more work. Irrational expectations on the part of speculators contributed to rapidly increasing food prices, particularly increasing prices on the futures markets. And if speculators are convinced that the prices will continue to go up, they will in fact continue to go up as long as the speculators keep outbidding the next guy. So you end up having a market for futures contracts rather than a market for the commodity. At some point, all of this is going to come crashing down, and that is in fact what has happened, particularly in the case of wheat. Not so much for rice, because rice is not traded to a great extent in the futures markets. The energy prices fluctuated a great deal. They went up to about $150 per barrel, went down, I believe, to somewhere around 60. Right now, I believe they're right around 100, somewhere between 90 and $100 per barrel. So that kind of fluctuations, of course, is transmitted to food price fluctuations in two ways. One, through production costs. It costs more to produce food when the energy prices are high. And second, by promoting biofuel production, taking resources out of food production, putting it into the production of raw material for biofuel when oil prices were high. And when oil prices came down, some of those refineries went broke. So again, you have this kind of fluctuation being amplified. Demand changes have been accused of causing fluctuations in food prices, and that is a truth with modifications. It is true that when the demand, for example, for animal products in China, or meat in China, dairy products in India, and increasing demand for products of that kind in other countries, it tends to put an upward pressure on food prices, but it doesn't really cause fluctuations. It puts more pressure on the system, and therefore the system becomes more sensitive to what does cause changes, fluctuations in the prices, if you understand what I'm saying. So to argue that because the Indians are now drinking more milk, we have more fluctuation, that is really stretching it a bit. But it puts more pressure on the system as such. But it isn't as though today a Chinese person eats no meat and tomorrow she eats 5 kgs. Of course, that's not the way it works. Farmers and others in the food system are responding to these price fluctuations, and the response depends on the kinds of things I'm showing up there. Are the farmers and the food systems agents informed? What's the degree of market information? Are they operating totally in the dark, or do they in fact have access to information? This is an area where we from outside the developing countries can help, strengthening the market information. There are still a few poor people out there that don't have cell phones, but of course many do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the information is available. So we need to work both on the hardware and the software. Government policies, of course, will influence the extent to which farmers can respond, and the supply responses themselves. Are farmers willing to take a risk, or are they going to hold back? I believe, and I think the evidence is clear on that, in fact, when you've got large price fluctuations, farmers invest less. Because remember, they have to make the investment today, and they don't have the output for another 3 to 6 to 9 months, depending on what commodity you're looking at. So it's a very risky business to buy your inputs today, get your loan today, not knowing what the price is going to be for your output. It's much easier for the consumer, because the consumer will go to the wet market or the supermarket and respond to the price at the time of buying. The consumer doesn't have to decide 6 months ahead of time what he or she is going to buy before knowing what the price is. Action issue number 7, we need to manage these amplifying factors. I don't think I need to say more about that, except we need a lot more negotiation in the World Trade Organization, and Kim Anderson is an expert on this, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that we need to try to get the members to pay attention to what they have agreed to, not only on the demand side, on the import side, but also on the export side. Now, do we have any way of enforcing those things? Probably not. There are some means within the WTO, but the workability is rather limited. So the action we need to take in response to what I have just said, investment in infrastructure. I'm going to repeat that several times before I finish, because I think that's one of the key issues for poor developing countries, including in infrastructure. And whether that's done by the national governments or by it is something that needs a lot more attention. Institutional innovation, cooperation, farmer associations, cooperatives, for example. We need to improve institutions. We need to improve the public goods that are needed for the private sector to operate. No, it is not a matter of whether it's private or public sector. It's a matter of the sequence. If the public sector doesn't make the investments, for example, in standards and measurements and contract enforcement and roads and market information, the private sector can't operate. So this debate we had in Washington, D.C. some years ago as to whether the public or the private sector should run the show was totally missing the point, because each of the two sectors have an important role to play. Domestic and international markets, I think I have already made reference to that. It is critically important that we work with governments to help them protect the effectiveness of the price signals. The price signals have an important role to play. And when a government says, we're going to control the prices because we don't like what the market is producing, first of all, they are stifling the market so that farmers can't respond to these potentially higher prices, so that consumers can't respond to the market prices. And secondly, the governments can't really control prices anyway. In a sense, that's the good part, because what happens when the government puts a price control in place without adjusting demand and supply, for example, through trade policy, then of course black markets are created, and the market will, in the final analysis, tell you what the price is for clearing it. The price transmission, when FAO decided that many, many more people were suffering from food insecurity, when the food prices went up, they were looking at the international food prices. The international food prices are transmitted to the poor person in a developing country more or less depending on a lot of factors. On the average, if you look at the studies available, roughly 1/3 of the fluctuation in the international price is transmitted to developing countries. And then that's the national price. Now, how much of that is transmitted to the poor person whose food security is on the line? And that depends on the individual country, on the infrastructure, on markets, and on a number of other things. It is very important that we help increase the price transmission for the same reasons I mentioned before, so that consumers and producers and traders can respond to what the market is telling us. As long as the price transmission is very limited. For example, when India put an export ban on rice, basically what they were saying is, we do not want the international rice price to be transmitted to India. And I have some beautiful slides, which I don't have time to show today, that shows that the rice price in Delhi basically didn't change when the international rice price tripled. And that was purely because India decided to protect its own consumers. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that happened. What governments tended to do was to put in place compensatory measures, transfer programs, social safety nets of various kinds. And that was wonderful because they were trying to protect poor people from the food price increases. Oh no, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. They were trying to protect the lower middle income consumer in the urban area. And that was already mentioned this morning. The poorest of the poor were in rural areas. Many of them are net buyers of food. They would be negatively affected by food price increases. Did the government help them? No. Why? Because they're not going to be a great threat to the government. They're not the ones that are out there burning cars and smashing windows. That's the lower middle income people in urban areas, so they were the ones that got the transfer programs. Was that true for all countries? No. Was it true for most countries? Absolutely. And this is where the political economy issues that Chris mentioned this morning are extremely important. What's driving those policymakers in developing countries is legitimacy, maintaining legitimacy. I don't want to leave my post until I'm good and ready, so if there is any threat out there, I'm going to try to deal with it. Yes, the rural poor are going to suffer, but you know what? They suffered before as well, and you know, they're not that important. That is not the way it is in China. In China, the Chinese government in Beijing does pay a lot of attention to what's happening in rural areas. But it's for the same reason that I mentioned before. It has to do with legitimacy. I think we need to worry about alternative energy sources, and it's not that in itself we could spend a few days talking about. But it seems to me that if we are going to adapt to climate changes, we need to worry a lot about alternative energy sources such as wind and solar. Action issue number 8, expand food production to meet future demand. Yes, of course we need to do that, and we need to focus on the smallholder, because that's where a lot of additional food production could take place. So we need to worry about the smallholder as an intended beneficiary, but not necessarily as the change agent. Now, what do I mean by that? By that I mean that much of what is needed in order to reduce the yield gap, meaning the difference between what the farmer currently produces and what he or she could produce with appropriate technology and appropriate prices and so on. That yield gap needs to be reduced, and it needs to be reduced dramatically by looking at the factors that keep the farmer from doing that All these adverse factors that the farmer is faced with. The infrastructure is not in place. In Africa, many of the farmers have to walk long distances before they get to anything like a path or a road where they can unload the marketable surplus. So I don't know how many of you would like to walk 50 kilometers with 100 kgs on your back, 100 kgs of maize on your back. I wouldn't. And so the infrastructure issues are extremely important. So we're going to tell the farmer, why don't you increase yields? And here's how you do it. And the farmer is going to tell you, I would do this if I could sell this crop at a reasonable price, if I didn't have to carry it 50 kilometers, if I could get access to fertilizers at a reasonable price, if I could get access to credit, if you would help me with the risk management that I just talked about, I will do it. How do I know that? Because there are hundreds of projects that did exactly that. They went into a farming community and they said, we're going to eliminate all these adverse factors. And let me just get the bridge in here. Here's the bridge. Walk over this bridge. We're going to help you with that. Oh, we're also going to give you access to fertilizers at a reasonable price. Those projects succeeded in farmers doubling or tripling yields, but only because they removed those exogenous factors, those adverse factors. Without removing those, the farmers are in a straitjacket. And you can improve the extension service as much as you want, you can tell the farmer as much as you want, but the problem solving is beyond the farmer's capability. So again, some of the policy interventions are very similar to those I mentioned before. Let me just mention the last two, because the other ones I think I have already mentioned. The pre- and post-harvest focused research. We need much more research in the post-harvest sector of the food system in developing countries. Now, some of that can be done by the private sector, some has to be done by the public sector. But this is where the action is going to be. It's post-harvest. As the population, as the income of the population goes up, the demand for processed foods, the demand for the services that are provided post-harvest is going to go up dramatically. We need a lot more research, a lot more intervention in meeting those future demands. We do need a lot of additional research, as I mentioned at the outset, for the primary production. And it is partly because we need to reestablish the foundation that is now available for farmers to double or triple their yields with the existing technology. If we stop doing research now, or if we continue with the very low levels of research for agriculture, that foundation won't be there 20 or 30 years from now. And I believe Phil Pardee is going to talk more about that, and maybe others as well. So I'm not arguing we should stop making investments in research. I'm saying we need to spend put a lot more effort into the post-harvest activities to remove those constraints that the farmers are faced with. Action issue number 9, sustainable intensification, meaning we need to produce more and we need to do it in such a way that we don't do damage to natural resources. Well, I'm sorry, that can't be done. If you believe in environmental Kuznets curve, it says that for income to go up, you have to do damage to natural resources. That's what this graph says. As income goes up, degradation goes up as well. That graph was developed on the basis of air pollution in some big cities, and it was just accepted as the going rate for, for degradation in agriculture, and of course, I do not believe it is true. So we've done some research at Cornell, and we have concluded that there is a phase 1 to this particular curve, and this phase 1 says that if you are very poor, you are doing damage to natural resources to survive. You're climbing up the hillside, you're cutting down trees, Yes, you know that you're going to mine the soil by not adding fertilizers, but fertilizers are too expensive. You can't afford it. You're trying to survive in the short run. You're doing damage to natural resources. Suppose that farmer could get access to better plant nutrients, more plant nutrients, whether it's organic or inorganic, whether it's fertilizers or manure or whatever it is. That farmer would then reduce soil mining, which has a positive environmental effect, increase production of food, and reduce poverty and hopefully escape poverty. You got a triple win right there. No, you can't get that. You can't get that from that. There are no triple wins. I'm so sorry. It's a trade-off. You either get income or you get good natural resources. I just don't believe it. So let's work on phase one. And let's help farmers achieve those double or triple or quadruple wins. Well, but what happens when the farmer gets to the bottom in this graph? Then he or she begins to behave as though the Kuznets curve was correct by doing damage to natural resources, by overusing fertilizers, by drawing down the groundwater level, etc., etc. That's why we need what I suspect is the most controversial in the context of what we're talking about today, namely full costing. We need to somehow begin to put a value on the damage we're doing to natural resources as well as the improvements that are happening to natural resources. And that cost or benefit would have to be incorporated into production costs and presumably passed on to the consumer. That would, in my dream world, create this bottom line. Can we do this? Well, we're going to have to give up something. And I have talked about this on a few other occasions, and the response I get from the audience is always the same. We can't afford it because it's going to increase food prices. Yes, it will. But can we justify asking future generations for paying for a living standard that we can't otherwise afford? Before I turn into a preacher, let me just suggest that while the food prices will go up in the short run, they will be lower in the long run. Because if we continue to degrade natural resources, the food prices will go up. If we learn how to manage natural resources, we can keep food prices at a lower level. And if I haven't offended everybody by now, I apologize and I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.